The sun hung low in the endless sky, its light spilling across the desert like liquid gold, warming the earth until every stone seemed to glow. The land stretched wide, wild and silent, yet beneath the silence something was stirring. At the edge of a lonely homestead, weathered by storms and years of solitude, a man moved with the patience of someone who had long ago accepted silence as his only companion. His name was Daniel Hayes, though no one had spoken it with tenderness for years. His shoulders were broad, his hands scarred by work and by battles he no longer spoke of, and his heart had folded itself into the rhythm of survival. Every morning he rose with the dawn, tended to his animals, checked the fences, boiled the coffee, and carried on as though each day was the same as the last. But life, no matter how carefully guarded, has a way of changing when one least expects it. There was a hush in the air that morning, a quiet too deep to be ordinary. Daniel felt it like a prickle against his skin, as if the desert itself was holding its breath. He did not yet know that destiny was riding toward him on a weary horse, carrying not only the weight of 20 years past, but also the promise of something his soul had forgotten it longed for: companionship, belonging, and the dangerous sweetness of love. For so long he had believed that silence was safety, that solitude was strength. Yet as hoofbeats drew nearer, echoing faintly across the dry wash, his heart betrayed him, beating faster with a rhythm he thought it had lost. Something in the air whispered change, whispered healing, whispered that the walls around his life were about to crumble. He straightened slowly, shading his eyes against the glare, and in that single breath his world tilted. A lone rider appeared at the horizon, a silhouette wavering through the heat. Not a caravan, not a company of men, just one figure pressing onward with determination etched into every line of her posture. Dust clung to her braids, her horse staggered beneath the strain of a long road, and yet she carried herself upright, strong despite exhaustion. The sight stirred something unspoken within Daniel. Strangers meant questions. Questions meant danger. He rested his hand on the revolver at his side, not to draw it, but because habit had carved vigilance deep into him. Still, his instincts could not explain why he felt an ache of recognition before he even heard her voice. She dismounted with unsteady legs, but her eyes, dark and unwavering, found his without a trace of fear. Her lips were cracked, her voice roughened by dust and miles, but her words struck harder than any bullet. "I came to marry you. I'm the little Apache girl you saved 20 years ago." The desert fell silent around them, as though even the wind stopped to listen. In that instant, time folded back on itself. Gunfire on a ridge, the terrified cry of a child, the burning sting of a bullet in his shoulder as he carried her to safety. He had buried that memory beneath layers of dust and years, convincing himself it belonged to another lifetime. And yet here she was, breathing, grown, unbroken, standing before him as living proof that some debts never fade. Daniel's chest tightened, torn between disbelief and recognition. He studied her face, the determination in her jaw, the exhaustion in her frame, the steadiness in her gaze. She was not here for charity. She was not here to beg. She had come to claim something she believed was hers, a bond sealed not by law or papers, but by the single moment when he had chosen to risk his life for hers. In that moment, the fragile balance of his solitude cracked. The man who had sworn to live untouched by the world found himself caught in the pull of a destiny written long ago. That night, As the desert cooled and stars carved silver lines across the sky, Daniel sat across the table from her in silence. They ate in the dim light of a single lamp, bread, beans, black coffee, the same meal he had eaten alone for years, and yet nothing tasted the same. The quiet between them was no longer empty. It carried weight, questions, the spark of something unspoken. She had come for him across endless miles, carrying scars of her own, and though he tried to tell himself that he owed her nothing more than shelter for a night, his heart knew otherwise. For the first time in years, Daniel Hayes was not alone, and the silence of his house felt like it belonged to both of them. The desert wind whispered outside, brushing the tin roof, as if urging him to face what he had long denied. That healing sometimes comes not from solitude, but from the courage to let another soul step inside. And as he looked across the table at the woman who had found her way back to him, he realized his story was no longer his alone. If these words stir something in your heart, if you feel the warmth of this story reaching into the quiet spaces of your soul, I invite you to leave a comment, to share your thoughts, and to join me by subscribing. Every small gesture, every word of encouragement is a gift of light that keeps stories like this alive. Together, we build not just a tale, but a community where love, resilience, and healing remind us that no heart is ever truly alone. And so the journey begins, not of a cowboy and a stranger, but of two souls who once crossed paths in fire and blood, now standing face to face in the stillness of the desert night, on the edge of something greater than either had ever imagined. Daniel rose before dawn as he always did, the rhythm of his life carved into his bones long before her arrival. The desert was still dark, a faint silver light tracing the edges of the horizon, the air cool with the softness that came only before the sun. He poured black coffee into a tin cup, the bitter scent filling the room, and stepped outside to breathe in the silence. But it was no longer the same silence. There was someone else beneath his roof now, someone whose presence stirred the air like a gentle ripple across still water. He told himself he would go on as usual, yet his eyes drifted toward the lean-to where she slept, her saddle still serving as a pillow, her breathing soft against the hush of morning. For the first time in years, he felt himself listening for another's breath, and it unsettled him more deeply than any storm. When the first light touched the land, he cooked breakfast, eggs fried hard, bread warmed against the skillet, coffee poured strong. He set a plate outside the lean-to without a word, meaning to slip away to his chores, but she emerged before he could. Her hair was bound neatly despite the dust of travel, her posture upright, her gaze steady. She ate without wasting a crumb, then carried the bucket to the well as if she had always belonged here, drawing water with hands that knew both hardship and endurance. Daniel's jaw tightened at her lack of hesitation. She asked no permission. She did not wait to be told her place. Yet something in him, something long dormant, felt a reluctant respect. She was no fragile wanderer in need of shelter. She was a woman who had chosen to stand where no one else would welcome her. Later that morning, he tested her unspoken resolve. A fence post had loosened in the night winds, and he walked her out to the line, meaning for her to watch as he worked. Instead, she crouched without a word and began packing stones around the post, her movements quick, practiced, unflinching. When the wire bit her palm, blood welled in a thin red line, but she did not flinch. Daniel cursed under his breath, catching her hand to clean the wound. She resisted at first, stiff and proud, but yielded as he wrapped a strip of cloth around her palm. He felt the thinness of her wrist. The rough calluses that spoke of years survived on little, and the calmness in her eyes that remained steady, even in pain. Something in his chest tightened, an ache of recognition. Here was a soul tempered by fire, one who bore her scars as proof she had endured. By nightfall, they sat together in the small lamplight. Daniel cleaned his rifle with the deliberate care of habit, while she mended his shirt with a needle she had carried all this way. The rhythm of their hands, scrape of cloth on steel, pull of thread through fabric, wove a quiet music between them. Neither spoke, yet the silence was not hollow. It pressed with questions both were not ready to voice. He found himself glancing at her often, as if to test whether she was real, whether the child he once carried, bleeding through smoke, could truly have become this woman who sat across from him with such quiet strength. When at last he asked her name, the one she carried now, she spoke it softly, her eyes watching him as if weighing whether he would accept it. He repeated it once, carefully, letting it settle in his memory alongside the graves he had marked and the cattle he had counted. She gave a small nod, the faintest easing of her shoulders, as though his acceptance was worth more than she would ever say aloud. The lamp burned lower, the house steeped in a warmth he had not felt in years, and when he lay down to sleep, he found himself listening again for the sound of her breath. It carried him into restless dreams of fire and gunfire, of a child's hand clutching his shirt, of choices made and choices yet to come. Days passed, each carrying a new rhythm. She split chores without being asked, fetching water, mending fences, grinding corn with steady hands. She moved as though she had claimed her place already, and he could not ignore the way her presence changed the shape of his world. At dusk, she lit a small bundle of sage, murmuring words in her language as smoke drifted across the yard. Daniel stood nearby, hat in hand, not understanding the words, but recognizing the weight of prayer, the calling upon the dead, the strength of memory. The smell carried him back to that ridge of fire 20 years ago, when he had carried her half dead across the rocks. He had buried that day deep, yet the smoke pulled it free, and for the first time in years, he allowed the memory to stay. That evening, he asked what had become of her after he let her go all those years ago. She spoke plainly. How disease had scattered her people, how whispers of shame had followed her, how even kin had tried to trade her for horses. She told it without plea, without self-pity, each word laid down like stones, hard and undeniable. Daniel listened, his chest heavy with the weight of her truth. He thought of his own losses, his wife and boy buried on the hill, his badge discarded after too much blood, his years of silence that had shielded him but left him hollow. Her story was not his, yet the weight of it was the same. 2 lives shaped by grief, bound by survival. For the first time, he wondered if solitude was not strength, but simply fear dressed in silence. And as he looked at her across the lamplight, beads laid carefully on the table beside her, he understood that the life he had clung to so tightly was already gone. In its place stood something fragile but alive, the beginning of a bond he had not asked for, yet could no longer imagine turning away. And so the days settled into a rhythm that was no longer his alone, each moment binding them closer, each silence thick with meaning. What had begun with a stranger's bold declaration was already unfolding into something neither law nor gossip could decide. It was the quiet birth of a life shared, fragile as dawn, yet carrying within it the healing warmth of a new beginning. The sun rose higher each day, casting long shadows across the homestead, and with every dawn Daniel felt the fragile balance of his life shifting further from the solitude he had once clung to. The woman's presence was no longer something passing. It had become part of the land itself, as steady as the fences, as necessary as the well. Yet beyond the quiet rhythm they built together, Daniel knew the world beyond their yard was watching. In towns like these, silence was a luxury, and curiosity spread like wildfire. By the fourth morning, the truth pressed upon them in the form of dust rising from the trail. A wagon appeared, the storekeeper's boy perched on the seat, bringing flour and salt, but his eyes lingered too long on the woman standing near the corral. Daniel felt the air tighten. Gossip had begun. He paid for the goods with his voice flat, and the boy left without questions, but his glance told enough. The town knew she was here, and they would want answers. By noon, another rider came, and Daniel's unease deepened. Deputy Clay Talon, badge polished brighter than his boots, rode slow into the yard. His gaze swept over everything, Daniel, the homestead, and finally her. He tipped his hat, but the gesture carried no warmth. "Morning, Hayes," he said, his tone even but edged. "Heard you've got company?" Daniel stood steady, arms crossed. "She's here," he replied simply. The deputy's eyes lingered, then shifted back. "Town likes to keep its records straight. Folks will ask who she is, where she belongs." "You plan to file papers?" The words hung heavy in the air, pressing against all the silence Daniel had built his life on. He gave no quick answer, knowing haste could look like weakness. At last he said, "Papers will come when they come. For now, she stays here. That's all anyone needs to know." Clay frowned, scribbled something onto a folded scrap of paper, and rode away with his horse kicking dust into the yard. Yet the damage was done. The first stone had been thrown into still water, and Daniel felt the ripples spreading. He turned to her, expecting fear, perhaps even regret, but she only moved to the kindling stack, shoulders squared, arranging pieces of wood with calm precision. Her silence spoke louder than any defense could. She would not let suspicion decide her place. That night, Daniel poured 2 cups of good coffee, the kind he usually saved for guests, and set one in front of her. His voice was low, the weight of years pressing in it. "This town keeps accounts. Sometimes fair, sometimes not. If you stay here, the account becomes ours to settle. That means stares, questions, worse if men think they can profit." She lifted the cup, sipped slowly, then placed it down with quiet strength. "If a person can share work and share bread," she answered, "they can share the account too." Her words settled into him, steadying something he had not realized was trembling. For years, silence had been his shield, but now her voice filled the quiet with a truth that felt stronger than any defense he could mount. After supper, she unwrapped a strip of cloth from her bundle, revealing a string of small shell beads, smooth with age and memory. She laid them on the table between them. "These belong to my mother," she said, her tone even, though Daniel heard the weight beneath it. He did not touch them, only looked at the beads with reverence. the way a man might study the fragile breath of new life. "Thank you for placing them here," he said, and his voice was rough with unspoken feeling. The days that followed tested them further. A windstorm swept across the land, bending fence rails, rattling the tin roof, pushing grit into every corner of the house. Daniel hammered boards and tied ropes while she drove the chickens into shelter and calmed the horse with a low, steady voice. She showed no fear of the storm, only purpose, and when the sky finally cleared, they stood side by side in the aftermath, mending what had broken. He noticed then how naturally they worked together, how easily they passed lessons back and forth. Her rawhide knots for his rabbit traps, his careful repairs for her steady stitching. Each exchange was quiet, practical, but beneath it pulsed something deeper, something that felt like healing. Yet Daniel knew storms of another kind were gathering. Townsfolk had seen her. The deputy had marked her name. It was only a matter of time before others came, men with papers, men with questions, men who saw opportunity in the fragile union of a cowboy and an outcast. One afternoon she rode into town for supplies, her list small: coffee beans, thread, salt. When she returned, the dust of the road clinging to her, Daniel read the tension in her face before she spoke. She set the sack down, jaw tight. "Some men push against the edges of a person to see where they bend." He said nothing, only nodded once. "Then they should learn there are edges that cut." His words were simple, rough, but she met them with the faintest easing of her shoulders. That evening, as the lamplight burned low, she asked him something she had carried since the first day. "You saved me once," her voice steady. "Why? You had no reason to risk yourself." Daniel paused, the fork in his hand lowering. He had not spoken of that day in years, but the truth came raw and unpolished. "Because you were a child. And because leaving you there would have stayed with me longer than a bullet. A man has to live with himself after the shooting stops." He did not look at her, but when he lifted his eyes, he found her watching him, her expression softened, the guarded lines eased. "I remembered," she whispered. In that moment, Daniel felt the last defenses of his solitude falter. He understood with quiet certainty that if she remained, their lives would no longer be defined by silence alone. What lay ahead would not be just survival. It would be choice, whether to send her away and guard the fragile peace he had built, or to stand with her, facing the judgment of a town and the greed of men who saw profit in weakness. As the desert wind brushed against the shutters and the lamplight flickered, he knew the decision had already been made. He had not turned her away. He had chosen her from the first moment she stepped down from that weary horse, and that choice now bound them as surely as any vow. And the desert outside lay wide and waiting, but inside the small homestead something rare had begun to bloom. The fragile, healing warmth of two souls who had carried loneliness like a burden, now finding in one another the promise of belonging. And though the world beyond their door might press harder with each passing day, Daniel Hayes knew with growing certainty that solitude was no longer the life he wanted. What had begun as a stranger's bold claim was already reshaping into a bond that no storm, no gossip, no paper could easily tear apart. The freight wagon came on a morning when the sky was too still, the kind of silence that carried warning. Daniel noticed the tracks first, heavy lines pressed into the dry earth, deeper than a rancher's cart. By the time the canvas cover marked Hanson Company rolled into his yard, he already knew trouble had found them. A man in a dark coat stepped down, narrow-shouldered, with a smile too polished to be trusted. At his side, a guard rested a Winchester across his knees, the casual threat of steel shining in the sun. "Mr. Hayes," the man said, unfolding a paper with deliberate care. "Name's Byrne. I represent certain interests. Seems there's been a mistake in the records. A matter of boundaries. That well you've dug sits on land not legally yours." He tapped the paper, voice smooth as oil, eyes sharp with calculation. Daniel kept his stance steady, hat brim low, his voice flat but edged with iron. "This well's mine. Dug it myself. Post set 8 years back. Sheriff marked it proper." Byrne laid the paper out on the table inside, smoothing it as if ink and seal outweighed years of sweat. The woman stood at Daniel's side, arms crossed, eyes locked on Byrne with a fire that refused to bend. Daniel read each word carefully, tracing the lines that spoke of irregular occupancy and disputed claims. The guard shifted his rifle, letting the threat hang in the air like heat. When Daniel set the paper back down, his words were simple. "This is false. The land and water are mine." Byrne's smile thinned, but he held his mask. "We'll see what a judge in Las Cruces decides." Before he could turn, the woman stepped forward, her voice calm and unshaken. "Bring the sheriff when you come back." For the first time, Byrne faltered, his eyes narrowing as if he hadn't expected her voice to carry such certainty. He gave a curt nod, then climbed back onto his wagon. Dust swallowed him as he left, but the weight he carried remained in the yard like a shadow. That night, Daniel sat at the table with a scrap of paper and a blunt pencil. He wrote a note to Sheriff Harper, the old lawman, long retired but still sharp, still owing Daniel a debt from years past. He sealed it, handed it to a boy passing with a mule, and paid him to deliver it into town. As the boy disappeared down the trail, Daniel stood in the doorway, arms crossed, the desert stretching endless before him. Inside, she shelled beads one by one, each soft click like a heartbeat, as if reminding them both what was at stake. 2 mornings later, Harper arrived, his bay gelding moving stiffly, but his presence still carrying the weight of authority. He read Byrne's paper, snorted halfway through, and tapped the false seal with a blunt finger. "Byrne's a snake. This here's nothing but paper dressing. The true records are in the courthouse. Clark will testify if pressed." Relief settled deep in Daniel's chest, not because the fight was over, but because truth had found a voice besides his own. Then she spoke, steady and sure. "And what about me?" The deputy asked about papers. "Without them, they'll keep pressing. What is required here for a marriage to be recognized?" Harper's eyes moved from her to Daniel, no judgment, only blunt truth. "Vows before a clerk or preacher, names signed, a witness, that's it. The law won't ask where you came from if the papers are clean." The room fell quiet, the air thick with unspoken weight. Daniel's throat tightened. For years he had avoided talk of marriage, burying the thought alongside the graves of his wife and son. Yet here it stood, plain and inescapable. He looked at her. Her eyes met his, without hesitation, not pleading, not demanding, only steady in the choice she had already made. "Yes," Daniel said at last, the word rough but firm. "Yes," she answered, her voice carrying the strength of someone who had walked too far to ever turn back. Harper nodded, wrote their names on foolscap, and marked the date. "Clark will be out this way at week's end." I'll witness." He slid the paper across the table, and in that simple act their bond crossed from silence into law. The days that followed shifted like earth after rain. She moved her bedding from the lean-to into the house, placing it by the window where morning light touched. Her shell beads hung above the sill, catching glints of sun like tiny fragments of memory. Daniel said nothing, but he felt the house itself change. No longer a place of solitude, but of presence, of belonging. At supper, she told him the last of her story, how a cousin had tried to trade her, how she had carried a knife to keep men from mistaking her silence for weakness. She spoke without pity, her voice even, but each word struck Daniel like a nail driven deep. His reply was simple, flat, but unyielding. "No one trades you here." For the first time, he saw her shoulders ease. That night, lying awake while she breathed softly near, Daniel felt a shift within himself as clear as dawn breaking. For years, his life had been about survival, about silence. But now, his purpose was no longer only to endure. It was to stand with her, to keep safe the bond that had risen out of dust and memory. He had thought himself a man alone, but now he understood. Healing sometimes comes not from walls built high, but from letting another soul place their beads, their scars, their story within your keeping. The desert outside lay endless, waiting, but inside the house a choice had already been made. Whatever storms, papers, or whispers came, they would meet them together. The silence that once defined Daniel Hayes was gone, replaced by the warm, fragile, and unshakable truth of two lives beginning to weave into one. The desert carried whispers long before men spoke them aloud. In town, her presence was already being measured, weighed, and passed from mouth to mouth like a coin. By the time Daniel rode in with her at his side, the stairs were waiting. The storekeeper's eyes flickered sharp, then softened when he noticed the quiet steadiness in her posture. A few men leaned against the hitching post, smirking as if ready to test the edges of what they thought did not belong. The deputy stood near the sheriff's old office, his gaze lingering too long, his silence sharper than words. Daniel did not look away. His hand rested close to hers on the reins, his back straight, his presence a shield. Every whisper faded when Sheriff Harper stepped out from the saloon porch, his nod a blunt declaration that whatever account the town kept, it was no longer theirs alone. It was shared, witnessed, and lawful. That night, back at the homestead, the air carried a gentleness Daniel had not felt in decades. Supper was plain, bread, beans, coffee, but the silence afterward was warm, not hollow. She reached across the table and asked him softly what had become of his family, the part of himself he had never spoken aloud since the graves were filled. His voice was rough, low, carrying the weight of years. Fever took them. My wife, my boy. Buried them east of here. After that, I left the badge, left the drives, thought distance was the only way to keep from losing again. He expected her to offer pity, but she only placed her hand lightly on his wrist, steady as a root in dry soil. No words, no softness forced, just presence. And it was enough. In her silence, he found something deeper than comfort, something healing, as if his grief had finally been seen without breaking him. Days blurred into a rhythm of shared work. She drew water, mended fences, rode beside him into the canyon to check the line where the cattle wandered. He showed her how to read the sky for storms, and she showed him the knots of rawhide that held strong under strain. At dusk, they sat on the porch with coffee cooling in their hands, the desert wind carrying the scent of mesquite. Sometimes they spoke of small things, sometimes not at all, and yet the silence between them was no longer emptiness. It was trust. Her beads hung by the window, catching morning light, and Daniel found himself glancing at them the way a man glances at the horizon to know where the day begins. But shadows still pressed in. Byrne returned, his wagon lighter, his smile thinner, his eyes sharper. He slowed near the homestead, watching as Daniel and the woman worked side by side at the gate. There were no papers this time, no polished words, only the weight of his stare before he turned away. It was a warning more than a departure, and Daniel felt it settle deep in his bones. Yet when he looked at her, shoulders squared, hair catching the sun, he realized the fear that once kept him silent no longer held him. Whatever storm Byrne meant to bring, they would face it together. As the weeks passed, neighbors who once lingered with suspicion began to trade instead of stare. A sack of coffee for a plough mended, eggs for help with calves. Harper came now and then, not as lawman, but as old hand with stories of weather and salt. Even the deputy's gaze softened. His questions fading into silence, he no longer dared disturb. The land itself seemed to change with them. Along the fence, they planted beans, marking the rows with a stone carved with two plain lines. Nothing ornate, just a quiet sign that two people had chosen to live here together. In the evenings, Daniel listened as she taught him words from her language, the syllables soft in his mouth, the healing sound of a tongue rooted in survival. In return, he traced letters on paper, teaching her the shape of English words so that the names and places of their shared life would not vanish. Through it all, Daniel felt the weight of choice pressing steady on him. For years, silence had been his shield. Now it was no longer enough. Her story had become his, and his land, his name, his home were bound to hers. The desert, vast and unforgiving, had carried them both through fire and loss, only to set them down here in this fragile but unshakable union. And as he sat with her beneath a sky scattered with stars, her hand resting close to his, he knew with a certainty as clear as dawn that he had not simply chosen her once. He was choosing her every day. The world beyond their yard would not cease testing them. But Daniel Hayes no longer feared what it meant to stand visible. Healing had come quietly, like water seeping into dry earth, and with it the strength to endure whatever came next. The silence that had once been his only companion was gone, replaced by something warmer, steadier, and infinitely stronger. The presence of a woman who had walked through exile and fire and chosen at last to stay. The days after the clerk's visit settled into a strange calm, the kind that felt fragile, as though the desert itself was waiting to see if their vows would hold against the world's doubt. Daniel kept the signed papers tucked in a wooden box beneath his bed, but more than ink and law, what bound them was the quiet certainty of having chosen one another. Each morning he woke to the soft rustle of her moving about the house, the smell of coffee rising, the light catching on the shell beads she had hung above the window. The house no longer breathed like a place of solitude. It carried warmth, rhythm, and the healing weight of presence. Where silence once pressed heavy, There was now a softer stillness, filled with the comfort of two lives intertwining. Yet even in the fragile peace, the desert tested them. One evening, as the horizon burned red with sunset, she winced at the tightening in her palm. The cut she had earned repairing the fence had grown angry, its bandage spotted with darker stains. She brushed it off with the stubbornness of someone who had endured worse. But when night came, the fever struck. Daniel woke to the sound of her breath ragged in the dark, her body burning hot beneath his trembling hands. Panic rose in him harder than any gunfight ever had. He fetched water again and again, pressing cool cloths to her forehead, whispering her name like a prayer he hadn't spoken in years. She mumbled words in her language, fragments of memory, drifting in and out of delirium. Hours passed like battles. Daniel's thoughts spiraled, of losing her after all she had endured, of the silence that would bury him if she slipped away. He had lived years telling himself solitude was safety, but watching her chest rise and falter, he knew the lie he had carried. Without her, the house would not simply return to quiet. It would become a grave. He leaned close, whispering rough truths against the fever's fire, that he needed her, that he could not return to life without her, that she had become more than a debt or a memory. She was his purpose. His voice broke on words he had not spoken to any living soul since the day he laid his family in the earth. When dawn broke, her fever broke with it. Her breath steadied, her skin cooled, and exhaustion left her sleeping heavy against the worn blanket. Daniel sat beside her, shoulders trembling with release, his head bowed in a silence no longer hollow, but filled with gratitude. He had feared loss more than death itself, and yet, in surviving the night with her, something within him healed. He realized love was not a weakness to be hidden. It was the only strength that kept a man standing when the storms came. When she opened her eyes hours later, weak but aware, he pressed a gentle hand against her shoulder. "Don't rise," he said softly, his voice raw. She studied him, reading the lines of strain still etched in his face, and for the first time since she had come to his door, Daniel did not look away. She saw the truth plain. His solitude was gone. He belonged to her, and she to him, not by law, not by circumstance, but by the choice they had both carried through fire and sickness. The days of recovery carried their own kind of tenderness. He made her broth, steadying her hand when she tried to lift the spoon. He drew water for her baths, his rough palms brushing hers with more care than he had ever shown in his life. Each gesture spoke what his words struggled to hold, that she was no longer a stranger under his roof, but the heart of the home itself. At night, he listened to her breathing, as though each rise and fall of her chest was a promise. When strength returned to her limbs, she moved about the homestead again, slower, but with her same quiet determination. She tended the horse, fed the chickens, ground corn into meal, as though resuming her claim to the life they were building. Yet something had shifted. Daniel noticed the way her eyes softened when they lingered on him, the way her hand brushed his when they passed dishes across the table. The fever had burned away the last remnants of distance between them. What was left was fragile, but undeniable. Trust, healing, and a love neither had spoken yet, but both carried in every glance. The desert nights grew cooler, the stars cutting sharp against the black sky. They sat together on the porch, coffee cooling in their hands, their silence no longer built on walls, but on the comfort of simply being. Daniel thought of the storms they had already weathered, the deputy's questions, Burns' false papers, the fever that nearly stole her, and he knew more trials would come. But when he looked at her, beads catching moonlight at her throat, her eyes calm and unbroken, he understood something he had not dared before. For 20 years he had survived on silence. Now, with her beside him, he was learning what it meant to live. And in the quiet of that desert night, he felt the stirrings of a vow not written on paper or spoken before a clerk, but carved into the deepest part of himself. Whatever storms rose, whatever threats pressed in, he would not face them alone. She had come to him through fire and memory, and now, together, they would walk into whatever lay ahead. The weeks following her fever passed with a rhythm that felt almost like peace, though Daniel never allowed himself to forget how quickly peace could shatter. Each morning began not with solitude, but with the quiet rustle of another presence moving about the house, her steps light yet certain, her hands tending to tasks as if she had always belonged within those walls. She rose early, her hair brushed neatly back, the beads she kept above the window catching the dawn's light like a promise. Daniel watched her in moments he thought she would not notice, the way she poured water from the well with strength steadier than her frame suggested, the way her face softened when she touched the horse's mane, the way she carried silence as though it were not a burden but a place to breathe. For a man who had spent years believing silence meant loneliness, he now discovered it could also mean healing. Yet the world beyond their fence line was restless. Byrne had not vanished, nor had the whispers of men who believed paper and coin held more weight than sweat and memory. One morning, Daniel found fresh wagon tracks cutting across the flats near his property, heavier than ranch traffic, purposeful and clean. It confirmed what he already suspected: Byrne was not finished. He carried the tracks in his thoughts all day, and when the freight wagon returned with Byrne seated stiff beneath his dark hat, Daniel was already waiting. This time, Byrne did not come alone. 2 men rode beside him, rifles balanced across their saddles, their eyes sharp with hired purpose. Byrne stepped down with the same narrow smile, unfolding another notice, this one sealed with wax. He handed it not to Daniel, but to Harper, who had stayed close since the fever, his old Henry rifle across his knees, as though he had been expecting this moment. The old sheriff broke the seal, read the lines slowly, and his jaw tightened. Then he looked up, his eyes cutting through Byrne with the weight of years. "This seal doesn't match the county mark. Clark changed it months ago. You've brought nothing but another lie." The guard at Byrne's side shifted, the rifle angling ever so slightly higher, but Harper's voice carried the steel of a man who had seen too many graves dug. "Son, lift that barrel even an inch, and I'll drop you before you draw breath again." The guard froze, the tension snapping like dry wood. Byrne's smile faltered, his mask slipping just long enough to show the frustration beneath. He folded the paper carefully, slipping it back into his coat. "This isn't over," he spat. Harper leaned forward, his voice flat and final. "Don't come back here with tricks. Next time it won't be words waiting." When Byrne's wagon disappeared over the ridge, Daniel felt his fists unclench only with effort. He turned toward her, expecting unease, perhaps even fear. Instead, she stood steady at the doorway, shoulders squared, eyes calm but unyielding. She stepped closer, her voice clear, stronger than he had ever heard it. "I want the papers. she said firmly. "Not because I need the town's blessing, but because I am done with being temporary." Daniel held her gaze, the lamp's glow catching in her beads, and something within him steadied. "I want them too," he answered, his voice low, raw with truth. "Because staying deserves a clear line." 3 days later, the clerk arrived in a borrowed buggy, Harper alongside him, neighbours trailing behind with thin excuses of delivering eggs or grain. Even the deputy came, his silence louder than his questions had ever been. Word had spread, and now all eyes rested on their yard. The vows were spoken without ceremony, plain words carrying more weight than any preacher's blessing. The clerk wrote them down, Harper signed his witness, and the neighbours strained to see ink dry upon paper. When it was finished, she unfastened the string of beads from her neck, holding them out to Daniel. For a moment he hesitated, then placed his hand over hers, the two of them holding the beads together as though binding past and present in one fragile circle. That night there was no feast, only bread, coffee, and a jar of preserved peaches a neighbour insisted be opened. Yet Daniel felt the house breathe differently, as if walls long accustomed to silence now recognized voices that would not fade. The papers lay in the wooden box beneath his bed, but the true bond lay in the warmth of her presence across the table, her voice steady, her eyes no longer searching for a place to belong, but resting in the certainty of where she had chosen to stay. The following dawn carried a light sharper than before, and for the first time in decades Daniel woke not to emptiness, but to the quiet knowledge that he was no longer surviving alone. The desert stretched wide and unforgiving beyond their fence, storms and whispers still waiting, but inside the homestead a vow had been spoken not once but twice, first in survival, now in choice. The healing that had begun with her arrival deepened into something unshakable. And though the world would test them again, Daniel Hayes knew with a certainty as steady as the earth beneath his boots that whatever came next, they would face it side by side. The desert seemed endless. Yet for the first time in 20 years, Daniel no longer felt lost in its silence. The papers were signed, their names inked on a page that the town could not dispute, but more than law, it was choice that bound them. He had not sent her away. Through fever, storms, and the threats of men who carried lies folded neat in their pockets, he had chosen to keep her near. And she had chosen to stay, her steps steady on ground that once rejected her. Together they turned a house of solitude into a home marked by presence. The days stretched into weeks, filled with small ordinary labours that carried the weight of something greater. She drew water, he chopped wood. He mended the corral, she kneaded bread. When storms pressed across the horizon, they stood side by side at the windows, waiting, steadying one another without needing words. There was no grandeur in it, no sweeping gesture. But Daniel discovered that love was not the thunder of passion alone. It was in the steady rhythm of shared work, the comfort of a hand brushing his at the table, the sound of her breathing in the quiet night. Healing, he realized, often arrived not in miracles, but in the patient presence of another soul willing to remain. In town, whispers had softened into something else. The deputy, who once measured her with suspicion, now kept his distance, his silence carrying reluctant respect. The storekeeper no longer hesitated when she entered with her lists, though his eyes still flickered with curiosity. He dared not voice. Neighbors began to trade not with caution, but with familiarity. Eggs for a repair, coffee for a sharpened plough. What had begun as stares turned into acknowledgement, and though prejudice lingered in the corners of some eyes, Daniel saw how her strength and his unwavering steadiness shifted the ground beneath gossip. They were no longer a question to be debated. They were a fact, a bond rooted deeper than ink or approval. One evening, Harper visited again, not as lawman, but as an old friend who carried the desert in his bones. He sat at their table, shared bread and coffee, and spoke of weather, salt, and the restless hunger of men like Byrne who were never satisfied. When he left, he clasped Daniel's hand with the weight of trust, then tipped his hat toward her, not as an outcast, but as a woman whose place was no longer questioned. Daniel watched the exchange, quiet pride pressing in his chest. For so long he had lived believing solitude was survival, yet here was proof that standing together had given him more strength than silence ever had. As seasons turned, the homestead changed in ways both small and profound. She planted beans along the fence, marking rows with care, each sprout a fragile promise of life, rooted where once she had feared exile. Daniel carved a stone near the well, marking it with 2 plain lines, not for others to see, but for them, a reminder that what they built was shared. She taught him words from her language, their sounds foreign yet grounding, weaving healing into his nights as he whispered them until they felt like his own. In return, he traced letters with her by lamplight, showing her how names and places could be written down, preserved, carried. The house filled with a quiet exchange of knowledge, of giving and receiving, as natural as the rising of the sun. In the evenings they sat together on the porch, cups of coffee cooling in their hands. The desert stretched before them, wide and unyielding, but the silence between them was no longer hollow. Sometimes they spoke, of storms, of cattle, of memories that surfaced like ghosts in the wind. Sometimes they did not. Yet in that silence, Daniel felt more than he ever had in the years he had lived alone. It was not the silence of survival, but of belonging, the stillness of 2 souls that had carried scars, yet found healing in one another's presence. And when night fell, when stars pierced the sky like scattered fire, Daniel rose with her, stepping inside not as a man retreating into solitude, but as a husband entering a home. The walls no longer echoed with emptiness. They carried warmth, laughter too soft to name, and the steady rhythm of a life shared. He had not thought such a life possible, not after graves, not after silence. Yet here it was, alive and steady, a love that had been tested by time, fire, and suspicion, and had endured. For Daniel Hayes, survival had once meant silence. Now, survival meant something richer, planting seeds that would grow, choosing each day to stay, holding close the woman who had crossed fire and exile to claim him. For her, exile had once meant being cast aside. Now, exile had ended. Not because the world had changed, but because together they had chosen to belong. And in that belonging, the desert itself seemed softer, the silence no longer empty, the stars no longer so far away. Their story was not one of easy roads, but of healing, of love found not in grand gestures, but in steadfast presence. And as the desert wind brushed over the homestead, carrying scents of mesquite and sage, the truth settled deep. What they had built could not be undone, not by gossip, not by lies, not by the hunger of men who thought paper weighed more than memory. It was theirs, bound in choice, bound in love, bound in the healing silence of a home no longer lonely. If this story has touched your heart, if you feel its warmth reaching into the quiet places of your own soul, I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments, to leave behind a piece of your voice in this circle. And if you wish to walk with me further into stories of love, resilience and healing, I welcome you to like this video and subscribe. Every gesture, small or great, is a thread of light that keeps stories alive, reminding us that no one is ever truly alone.